Somewhere in the jungles of Guatemala, there's a pyramid taller than a 15-story building. For 600 years, nobody outside the jungle even knew it existed. The trees had simply taken it back. Over 60,000 people lived here. It had markets, royal courts, astronomers who tracked Venus more precisely than European scientists would for another 700 years. And then, in the span of less than 2 lifetimes, it emptied. Not just Tikal. Across an area the size of Italy, dozens of great cities went silent within 150 years of each other. If you're new here, welcome. This channel exists for exactly this kind of question, the moments in history that don't have a clean answer, the mysteries that real evidence is still being pulled out of the ground for. Today, we're going to walk through one of the biggest ones in the Americas, what actually happened to the Maya. And I promise you, the real answer is stranger, and more relevant to us, than any single villain could ever be. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why archaeologists spent over a century looking for a conqueror, and found a mirror instead. Before we talk about the fall, you need to actually see what was lost, because most people picture gray stone ruins. That's not what this looked like. Maya temples weren't bare stone, they were painted blood red, brilliant blue, covered in carved gods and kings. Markets were loud, full of cacao traders, jade carvers, weavers selling cotton dyed in colors that have barely survived the centuries. Visual, map graphic, glowing dots lighting up across the Yucatan Peninsula, Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, Palenque, Caracol. The Maya were never one empire. That's one of the first myths to drop. They were more like ancient Greece, dozens of independent city-states, each ruled by its own king, or Keohulaja, a holy lord. They allied with each other. They went to war with each other. They married into each other's royal families. What tied them together wasn't a government. It was a shared culture, language, religion, a calendar system so accurate it predicted eclipses centuries in advance. Visual, close-up of carved glyphs on a stela, slowly translating on screen, and they wrote. The Maya developed the only fully developed writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas, thousands of glyphs representing both sounds and whole words, carved into stone, painted onto pottery, and written into bark paper books called codices. At its absolute height, around 750 CE, historians estimate the Maya world held somewhere between 7 and 11 million people. Some cities were more densely populated than medieval London. This is the world we're talking about. Not a primitive society, a sophisticated, interconnected civilization at the height of its power. And within 200 years, most of it would be gone. Here's what makes this collapse so eerie to archaeologists. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't one event. It was a slow, staggered unraveling, and it didn't hit everywhere at once. The first major city to fall apart was Copan, in modern Honduras, around 800 CE. Then it was the cities along the Usumacinta River, Piedras Negras, Yaxchilan. Then the heartland, Tikal, Calakmul, by the early 900s. Visual, archaeologist excavating an abandoned plaza, weeds growing through stone. One of the clearest signals comes from something almost mundane, stelae. These were the carved stone monuments kings erected to record their reigns, their victories, their connection to the gods. For centuries, Maya kings carved a new one roughly every 20 years, like clockwork. Then, city by city, the carving just stops. No more dated monuments. No more recorded kings. As if the institution of kingship itself simply dissolved. So the first question archaeologists had to answer wasn't, what destroyed the Maya? It was, why did this happen gradually, city by city, instead of all at once? That staggered pattern is actually the biggest clue we have. For most of the 20th century, this was the great unsolved mystery, until scientists figured out how to ask the land itself what happened. In the 1990s and 2000s, researchers began drilling sediment cores from lakes across the Yucatan, places like Lake Xixancanab and Lake Punta Laguna. Every layer of mud at the bottom of these lakes is basically a time capsule, year by year, going back thousands of years. What they found was staggering. Embedded in those layers was a mineral called gypsum, which forms in larger quantities during severe drought. And the gypsum spiked dramatically, again and again, between 800 and 1000 CE. Some estimates suggest annual rainfall during the worst of these droughts dropped by 40 to 50% compared to normal years. And these weren't single bad seasons. Some droughts lasted years. A few may have stretched on for over a decade. Now here's why that mattered so much for the Maya specifically. Unlike Egypt with the Nile, or Mesopotamia with the Tigris and Euphrates, the Maya lowlands had almost no permanent rivers. Their entire civilization ran on seasonal rainfall, captured in man-made reservoirs called choltana. When the rains failed for years at a time, there was no backup system, no river to fall back on. Crops failed, reservoirs ran dry. And when archaeologists overlay the timeline of these droughts against the timeline of city abandonment, they line up almost perfectly, but here's the problem with stopping the story there. The Maya had survived droughts before, there's evidence of earlier dry periods that didn't trigger collapse. So something about this drought was different. Or something else was happening at the same time that made the Maya far more vulnerable than they'd been in the past. That's where it gets uncomfortable. In 2018, a massive LiDAR survey covering over 2,100 square kilometers of Guatemala's jungle revealed something nobody fully expected: the Maya lowlands weren't sparsely settled wilderness with a few big cities. They were almost entirely developed, terraced farmland, causeways, irrigation systems, and over 60,000 individual structures, far more than previous estimates. That level of density meant the Maya had been clearing forest at a massive scale for centuries, for farmland, for firewood, and for the lime plaster that coated their temples bright white. And deforestation doesn't just remove trees. It changes the local climate. Trees pull moisture up from the ground and release it into the air, helping generate rainfall. Strip enough forest away, and you can actually reduce regional precipitation. Recent climate modeling studies have suggested something unsettling: the megadroughts that hit the Maya world may have been partly self-inflicted, or at least significantly worsened by the Maya's own land clearing. At the same time, population had pushed well past what the land could sustainably support. Soil across the lowlands was being farmed continuously, without enough time to recover. Studies of ancient soil layers show increasing erosion in the centuries leading up to the collapse, sediment washing off overworked hillsides into lake basins. In other words, by 800 CE, the Maya weren't just facing a natural disaster. They were facing a natural disaster they had spent centuries setting themselves up for. It's the kind of pattern that, frankly, should sound uncomfortably familiar to anyone watching this in the 21st century. As crops failed and resources shrank, something else escalated sharply across the Maya world: war. For most of the classic period, warfare between city-states had existed but was relatively limited, often ritualized conflicts to capture royal captives for sacrifice rather than full territorial conquest. But starting in the late 8th century, the inscriptions changed tone entirely. At dos Pilas, Caracol, and other sites, monuments from this era boast of burned palaces, captured kings, entire dynasties wiped out. Some sites show evidence of hastily built defensive walls, something almost never seen in earlier, more stable centuries. Archaeologists studying skeletal remains from this period have also found a rise in trauma injuries consistent with violence, along with signs of nutritional stress, bones that show people were simply not getting enough to eat. This wasn't a unified civilization being invaded by an outside force. This was dozens of independent kingdoms, already weakened by drought and resource collapse, turning their remaining strength against each other, fighting over the same shrinking water sources, the same shrinking farmland. It's a brutal feedback loop. Drought weakens the harvest. A weaker harvest fuels desperation. Desperation fuels conflict. And conflict destroys the very infrastructure, reservoirs, terraces, trade routes, that might have helped a city survive the drought in the first place. By around 900 CE, most of the great cities of the southern lowlands, Tikal, Calakmul, Caracol, Copan, had been abandoned. Not conquered by a foreign empire. Emptied from the inside, kingdom by kingdom. And here's where most documentaries, and most textbooks, frankly, get this story wrong. The Maya did not vanish. What collapsed was a specific political system, in a specific region, over a specific window of time. The southern lowland cities emptied out. But Maya civilization itself kept going for another 700 years. In the north, cities like Chichen Itza rose to prominence in the very centuries the south was collapsing, building a new political order with closer trade ties to central Mexico. Later, Mayapan became the dominant power in the region, lasting until the 1400s. What actually ended the last fully independent Maya kingdoms wasn't a mystery at all. It was the Spanish. The conquest of the Maya world wasn't quick, and it wasn't easy. It took the Spanish Empire over 170 years, starting in the 1520s, to subdue the various Maya kingdoms. The Itzá Maya, ruling from their island capital of Najbatan in Lake Petén Itzá, held out longer than almost any other indigenous nation in the Americas. They weren't conquered until 1697, nearly 2 centuries after Columbus. The conquest brought catastrophic disease, smallpox and other Old World illnesses devastated populations who had no immunity. It brought forced labor, forced religious conversion, and the deliberate destruction of Maya written knowledge. In 1562, a Spanish bishop named Diego de Landa ordered the burning of Maya codices in the town of Mani, believing them to be works of the devil. Of the thousands of bark paper books the Maya are believed to have produced over centuries, only 4 are known to survive today, held in museums in Dresden, Madrid, Paris, and Mexico City. Think about that for a second. An entire civilization's written history, reduced to 4 books. So if you came into this video looking for a single villain, a conqueror, a curse, a lost city swallowed by aliens, the truth is more complicated, and honestly more human. The classic Maya collapse wasn't caused by one thing. It was environmental stress meeting political fragility. Severe, possibly self-worsened drought. A population that had pushed past what its land could sustainably support. And independent kingdoms that, instead of uniting against a shared crisis, turned on each other as resources ran out. And centuries later, the kingdoms that survived that collapse were ultimately ended not by their own mistakes, but by an entirely external force, European conquest, disease, and the deliberate erasure of their written history. There's no single culprit you can point a finger at. There's a chain of cause and effect spanning over 1,000 years. Here's the part that gets left out of most of these stories: the Maya are still here. Today, over 7 million people across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras identify as Maya. Their languages, more than 24 distinct ones, are still spoken. Their descendants still farm maize using techniques that trace back thousands of years. They still walk past the same stones their ancestors carved, in the same jungle that swallowed their cities. The jungle didn't destroy the Maya. It just outlasted their kings. If this is your first time on this channel, this is exactly the kind of history we dig into here. Not the textbook version. The version backed by the actual evidence, pulled out of lake beds and laser scans and stone carvings that took decades to translate. If you want more of these deep dives into lost civilizations and the mysteries still being solved beneath our feet, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the next one might change how you see something you thought you already knew.